the bank. Is that a good thing? No. Probably need to wait on God to give me the money instead of going to rob a bank. So she took the initiative, which was a good thing, but she did it without consulting God. And when that happens, there's a problem. In fact, there are a number of problems, and we're still dealing with some of them today. So we're going to look at this and kind of see what's going on. Let me give you kind of an overview of this passage, or a summary statement. Failing to wait on God produces problems. Believers should trust God and wait on Him because He always sees them, He never fails them, He knows their needs and their distresses. Abraham was going to learn this lesson intensely later on at a point in his life. Anybody know where that was? When he found out that God knew his need, God saw his need, and God met his need. With Isaac, when he was getting ready to offer him. Remember, he was getting ready to offer Isaac over in chapter 22, verse 14. He raises a knife up, and he's getting ready to kill him, and God says, hey, hang on, stop, I've got something for you. And what did Abraham call that place? Jehovah-Jireh. Now, typically when we talk about the name Jehovah-Jireh, most people say Jehovah-Jireh means God provides, and they miss the most important parts of that name of God. That's the last and really the least important aspect of that name Jehovah-Jireh. The first is that God knows our needs. The second, and possibly the most important aspect of Jehovah-Jireh that we forget, is that God is with us in our needs. Had God forsaken Abraham and Hagar in this situation? He knew the need, He was with them in the need, and then finally, He met the need. So often we forget this idea, and they forgot who God is. And so as we get into this chapter, we want to kind of take a look at some of these verses and find out what's going on here. Seems that as we go through this process with Abraham, from the time we meet him as Abram until the time he's Abraham and Isaac is born, there's a learning process. This is one of those learning processes. Now, I put up a small outline to kind of show you there's some parallelism going on here. First, we find there's a tension or a problem, and Sarah was barren. Then she makes a speech. Notice in verse number 2, we're going to kind of look over this and we'll go back and we'll walk back through it. In verse number 2, she said, behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. So immediately she's putting the blame on who? God. It's God's fault. Now we'll see later that says some things about her knowledge of God's power, but she's blaming God. Abraham follows the suggestion, and he says in verse number 2, the last part, Abram hearkened, so he listened, and then Sarai gave Hagar to Abram. Again in verse number 3, he gave her to her husband, and it's interesting, the last word of verse number 3 is what? Wife. Now, she came out of Egypt as a what? A servant, a piece of property. And so when we look at the tension here that's going on and the difficulties in this relationship in the future, she's been exalted from simply a concubine to a wife. And we'll look at the dynamics of that. Then in the second half of the passage, we see more issues come up. Hagar, the tension is now Hagar despises Sarai, so there's a problem there because they're both wives and they should be equal, but one is trying to look better than the other. Then, now notice what Sarai does. Verse 5, and Sarai said to Abram, my wrong be upon thee. You know what she's saying literally? This is your fault. By the way, we're not looking at any fault here because back in chapter 12, whose bright idea was it to go to Egypt? Okay, Abram's. We're looking at principles here of what happens when we take our eyes off of God, not looking to assign fault in who did what. And then we find that Abraham basically turns Hagar over to Sarai again. She's his wife, but now he puts her back under the authority of Sarai, and it doesn't work out very well. And we find here basically Abraham responds passively as this situation goes on. And so as we go through the passage, we find that Abraham only speaks one time. There's one recorded response of Abraham. His wife speaks twice. Hagar speaks two, possibly a third time. But as we get to the end of the chapter, we're going to find God step in. And we're going to find the angel of the Lord. And guess who says the most in this chapter? The one that they weren't trusting. The angel of the Lord comes in, settles it, gives them direction. And so let's kind of look at that. I wanted to kind of give you an overview, and then let's kind of jump in. Verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. We see, first of all, she's barren. Now they knew she was barren. This wasn't new news to them. Look back, if you would, to chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse number 30. But Sarai was barren, she had no child. So they knew this going in. Chapter 15, verse number 2, Abraham says, seeing I go childless. And then we come to chapter 16. So it wasn't like they were merely on their road to the promised land, and they were getting in the promised land, and Abraham says, hey, now we're here, now let's start a family, and boom, they get hit between the eyes with this news that can't have kids. And they're getting older. Okay, how old was Abraham when Isaac was born? Anybody remember? They were old, okay? Hebrews basically says they were so old it's like they were dead. I mean, that's pretty old, okay? But the issue here is more than just not having a child. It was a serious problem back in the day. Two reasons. Number one, if a couple in their culture didn't have children, it was considered a huge misfortune, a huge overwhelming problem. It was bad on the husband, but it was worse on the wife. The measure of a successful wife, ladies, back in the day, was to have like 20 or 30 kids. Well, maybe not 20 or 30, but to have a big brood of kids following you around. If you couldn't have children, then you're considered, regardless of what else you did as a wife, no matter how good you could cook, no matter maybe how good you could sew, or if you're the best housekeeper in the desert, if you couldn't have kids, you're considered a failure. And so that's playing into what's going on here. But also you've got to understand, as we read through these narratives, when you study Old Testament narratives, you've got to understand the Old Testament mindset. All right, let me throw this out. In our mind, Sarai saying, hey, Abraham, go take Hagar to be your wife. What would we typically think about that? Ladies, how many of you ladies would say, hey, I can't have kids, so husband, I've got this other lady, but you can have her to be your wife too. Any of you ladies going for that? You might be going for a gun if your husband suggested it, but you're not going there. Okay, the ancient Near East mindset was such in having children that if they could not have children, what they're doing here was a natural and accepted and almost expected practice. And so that's why there's no shock from Abram when it's suggested. That's why she doesn't hesitate to suggest it, because it was absolutely a normal thing to do. It's a socially acceptable thing to do. Now, it wasn't a morally right thing to do. Understand, though, the law hasn't been given. Sometimes we try to take situations like this and stick it at the end of Deuteronomy. Okay, the law hasn't been given yet. We know from Genesis that God's plan is one man, one woman forever, but we don't know for sure that Abraham's been even exposed to that. So this is a socially acceptable thing to do, but it shows there's a lack of faith in God. And ultimately, it shows it violates that one man, one woman for life principle, and they reap the results of it, don't they? All right? The second problem, if I can find it here, is that God had told them what he was going to do. He had told them, I'm going to give you a son. Now, time had passed, but God's promise didn't go away. And so we see that they're trying to do this deal with this handmaiden, this slave, and we talked about back when we studied Onesimus in the book of Philemon. I think a couple folks brought up the idea of slavery and how did that work out with believers. Again, in their day, it was nothing to go to a country and buy somebody, and they became your property. So Hagar was property. She was an Egyptian, and of course, that point, in fact, most people believe that they actually came across her when they were in Egypt, back when Abraham went down there. All right? So there are those two issues. But what we see God continually doing is eliminating the outs that Abram was trying to take and continually pointing Abram and Sarai back to himself. When they went to Egypt, how'd that work out for them? Didn't work out good at all. In fact, Pharaoh says, hey, you guys got to go. This didn't work out for them. They were trying to handle God's plans for their lives through carnal methods, and it never works. It'll never work for us today. Right. We cannot manipulate God's will. We can't help God out. He doesn't need our help. What he needs us to do is to trust him and walk by faith and learn to wait on his timing. Not try to fix it ourselves. Especially when it seems impossible, or especially when it comes to God fulfilling one of his promises. I've known people throughout the years that they've done everything from get in debt to end up losing their family over trying to run ahead of God and fix something themselves instead of waiting on God. So we come back to chapter 16, verse number 1, or actually verse number 2. Notice Sarah knew who God was. And this is so interesting. Notice what she says here. The Lord hath restrained me from bearing. You got to stop and think about the theological implications of that statement. She knew who God was. She knew that God had the power to stop her from having a kid. But she was not thinking it all the way through, was she? If she knew God had the power to restrain her from having children, what does that also imply? God has the power to give her children. And of course, she would find that out later. She recognizes that God is the creator, that God has all power, but she fails to realize that God's not on her timetable. And so God doesn't authorize this scheme, and then all kind of problems come from it. And wow, we're out of time. We got to stop right there. Okay, we'll pick up in verse 2 next time. I hope this is a good reminder for you. I was reading through this passage and it just kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. So often we just absolutely say we know who God is, just like she's done here, and then we, in the next breath, determine we know more than God does and we can fix stuff instead of trusting him. And let me tell you, folks, if this is the way you're thinking or the way you're headed or things you've done, you're going to end up in a mess neck deep just like Abram and his wife did. There's no other way around it. Wait on God. Wait on his timing. Allow him. Remember that he knows your need. He's with you in your need. And he has the right answer for your need. In his time, he'll provide. All right? Let's stop there and let's pray. Father, thank you tonight for this reminder from your word of who you are and how great you are, and Lord, how you can answer our prayers, meet our needs. Thank you for this account we have that's a reminder of that. Help us to remember it as we go through our daily lives. Help us to trust you and to walk with you. We pray you bless this time now. We ask in Christ's name.